karaoke.
All right, you're good, mate.
Hello, everybody, and greetings from Rhode Island, USA. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Mark Allio, and I'm a longtime Explorers Club member and the New England chapter officer at large. I'm going to start off by sharing some context tonight, but first I want to thank Ann Passer, our club's local public lectures chair, who reached out to me to explore how we might pay homage to Native American people through this forum as we consider the Thanksgiving holiday tradition commonly celebrated throughout North America. I'm here in Providence, Rhode Island, capital of Rhode Island, our smallest state, one of the 13 original British colonies, and one of several founded on the basis of freedom of religion. We were not the first colony. That distinction is attributed to the settlements founded in Virginia in 1609, followed by Plymouth, Mass, New York, Massachusetts Bay, and then Rhode Island. But we are unique in that this place is where, sadly, the first scale organized conflict occurred between multiple Native American tribes and the colonists, accompanied by great loss and tragedy in more ways than one. Most Americans are taught in school that the Thanksgiving tradition recreates a benevolent feast shared between colonists who arrived in 1620 on the Mayflower in Plymouth, Mass, and the Wampanoag tribe, the most prominent tribe to the east of Providence, inhabiting the East Bay of Rhode Island, Southeast Mass, the Cape, and the islands. As you will learn, there is much, much more to this tradition and story. It's said that when Roger Williams, an English minister who was exiled from Massachusetts Bay Colony in October 1635, first encountered the Narragansetts here, the most prominent tribe in the West Bay, the greeting "What cheer, Nitop?" was exchanged, a combination of English and Narragansett, which translates loosely to "What's up, friend?" This phrase can be found on the official seal of the city of Providence, the settlement Williams went on to establish here thanks to his relationship with the Narragansetts. The indigenous tribes and colonists coexisted here for a few decades, but eventually the Wampanoags and the Narragansetts and other local tribes led an effort to reclaim their traditional lands and heritage, though what followed was a sad harbinger of what was to come for Native Americans throughout North America. So we thought it would be not only timely, but incredibly important to hear a Native American perspective on this holiday through a different lens. Tonight, I'm very proud and thankful to welcome my fellow Rhode Islander, Silvermoon LaRose of the Narragansett Indian Tribe and Assistant Director of the Tomaquag Museum in Exeter, Rhode Island. The Tomaquag Museum is Rhode Island's only Indigenous-led museum, one of the oldest in the country, dedicated to educating the public and promoting thoughtful dialogue regarding Indigenous history, culture, arts, and traditional ecological knowledge to build a connection to Native issues of today. As Assistant Director, Silvermoon helps manage the museum's collection and archives, cultural education, and Indigenous empowerment projects. She has worked in tribal communities for over 20 years, serving in the areas of health and human services and education. Throughout her career, she has had the opportunity to travel extensively, learning from Indigenous communities throughout the United States. As an artist and educator, Silvermoon hopes to foster Indigenous empowerment through education, community building, and the sharing of cultural knowledge and traditional arts. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and a minor in Justice, Law, and Society from the University of Rhode Island. Welcome, Silvermoon. Very happy to have you here.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Wininakan. Nataswi Silvermoon LaRose at Narragansett, Kanupiama Aki at Narragansett. Welcome to the lands of the Narragansett. I am of the Narragansett Nation and also the Niantic Nation here in Rhode Island. the Eastern Niantic were a smaller tribal community in southern Rhode Island, and our communities merged, the Narragansett and the Niantic tribes. So we do want to honor them by always including them as part of our heritage. I'm happy to share some information with you guys. This is an interesting topic we get asked to share about a lot at this time of year. But I think it's also important. There's a lot of things happening within our communities at this time of year, and understanding what lens we're coming from when we talk about Thanksgiving, because it differs for Native communities than maybe for mainstream America, so that this will give us an opportunity to kind of delve into that. I'm coming from the Tomaquag Museum, just so that people know, Tomaquag is just the Narragansett word for beaver. It's pronounced Tomaquag, and it's just a beaver. When the museum was first founded, it was in Ashaway in a little hamlet known as Tomaquag Valley. So that's why they took the name Tomaquag Museum. But often we get asked if we are part of the Tomaquag tribe. There is no Tomaquag tribe. It's just the word for beaver. So I like to be clear on that. But today we're going to talk about both the myths behind Thanksgiving, but also about what we call 13 Thanksgivings. Tabutan Tamawak is our word for Thanksgiving. And in Indigenous communities here in New England, we celebrated 13 Thanksgivings. Now they differed from community to community. And it's also important to understand that although they followed a moon cycle, they were in those moon cycles, our Thanksgivings were fluid because they followed the changes in the season and what was happening in the natural world. So as we know with nature, things change from year to year. So they had much more fluidity. So there's no sound rules on it. So I want to share my screen with you so that I can start this presentation and make sure I don't go off on tangents, which can happen. So we're going to be talking about breaking the Thanksgiving myth today. So these are 5 questions about Thanksgiving we're going to delve into throughout this presentation. What is Thanksgiving? When was the first Thanksgiving? Why do we celebrate Thanksgiving the way we do now? And do Indigenous people celebrate Thanksgiving? And lastly, how can we still celebrate Thanksgiving, if at all? So we'll delve into all of those a little bit deeper. So what is Thanksgiving? I think Thanksgiving has become a beloved holiday of our American community. It's a time when we gather with family and friends, we share a meal together, we remember things we're thankful for. But this was all birthed out of a lot of other things that happened throughout this country's history. And that's what we want to get into a little bit. The idea of giving thanks is not new. It is something that Europeans did as a daily virtue. There were European traditions that were very diverse all over Europe around harvest celebrations, where they would give thanks for the harvest. So these Thanksgiving ceremonies were happening widely throughout European countries before Europeans came to the new lands, what we call Turtle Island. Colonists celebrated Thanksgivings throughout the year. It wasn't just at one season, because harvests happen throughout the year as you're bringing in your garden, but also there are other reasons we give thanks, other ceremonies that are built around giving thanks. So this was not something new to Europeans to celebrate Thanksgiving. This is a part of their tradition. Likewise, it's a part of Indigenous traditions. In our community, we have 13 Thanksgivings, Tambutan Tamawak. This was also because we had a daily virtue of giving thanks for all of the gifts that we received from Creator and from our Earth Mother. We acknowledged all of those gifts with offerings and with prayer. This was our ceremony around thankfulness. Indigenous people traditionally celebrated these Thanksgivings throughout the year. It was a time to reflect on our ecosystem, what was happening within each season, giving thanks for the gifts of land and water, and thanking Creator for all of these gifts. So in our 13 moon calendar, which I keep bringing up the turtle, because if you notice on Turtle's back, You'll hear traditions of 13 moons on turtle's back. There's 13 squares on the back of the turtle, if you're able to count them, and each of them correlate to a different moon season. And throughout these seasons, these moon changes, there are different times of thankfulness. So in the winter time, we have the big snow, the heavy snows falling. This is a time of rest, a time of covering of Mother Earth, and everything is going to sleep underneath her cover and being reborn, being rejuvenated, getting ready to burst forth again in the springtime. Is going to sleep underneath her. Oh, I could hear myself. That was and so during this season of heavy snow, we're inside more, we're gathering more as communities, and it's the perfect time for our storytelling moon. It's a time where we can gather together and our stories are passed on. This was a way of carrying on oral traditions for people to be able to listen to the stories of the elders. It's entertainment, but this was also an important part of passing on information generationally. These stories, they shared our virtues, our beliefs, our traditions, those lessons that were meant to be learned. And they did it in a fun way that wasn't judgmental, that wasn't telling us what we should believe, but giving us the chance to figure it out for ourselves through these stories, as many of the stories have characters that are dealing with things that we learn how to deal with those same things in our own lives. So stories were very important, and we celebrated with stories. Then when we get to that season, that time where it's freezing cold at night, but then it kind of warms up during the day above freezing levels, the sap in our trees begin to flow. And that's the time for harvesting tree saps for syrup. You can get syrup from many different types of trees. Black walnut will give you syrup. What else? Sugar, birch will give you syrup. So there's other trees that will give you syrup, hickory syrup as well, I believe. But maple syrup was the one that was the most important because it gives the most sap that can be boiled down to make that important sweetener. This was the only natural sweetener we had, were these tree saps. We didn't have honeybees here. We didn't have sugar beets and all of those kind of other ways of gathering stevia. Ugh, hate that stuff. So maple syrup was extremely important. And it was something that took an enormous amount of work to be able to gather and store for later use throughout the year. So it was a time that many people had to come together and work together in order to create that syrup and get that all cooked down into sugar to be stored. And making the cones from birch bark that they would be stored in, because birch bark is actually a naturally antibacterial, so it would keep that sugar clean throughout the storage period. So this was a really important time. And when spring finally breaks, it brings, what's that saying, April showers bring May flowers. We get those storms in springtime, all of that rain that falls to the earth and helps things to grow and rejuvenate and come back. So that's when we are being visited by our thunder beings. And this is the spring moon. This is the time of that rebirth. When spring comes, we have our fishes that start moving upstream to spawning grounds. And that's when we would have our fishing moons. We would gather by the waterways to collect the fish that was going to be dried and stored. In the late spring, our planting moon, when it's time to put those seeds into the ground and we're praying for them to germinate. Then the first berry appears, our strawberry, the first berry of spring. Right at the end of spring, beginning of summer, and we know that warm weather is here, and we share this gift with our loved ones, a reminder to love each other. There's stories around that. We have our green bean, our green corn, which is one of our most important celebrations here in Southern New England, and comes up again. I will mention that again in some of the history of Thanksgiving. but that was an important ceremonial time. Our annual August meeting powwow for the Narragansett community that happens in August, the second weekend in August of every year. It's the oldest recorded Native gathering in the United States. All that means is that it got put on paper by colonists, and it's been on record as having taken place annually ever since. So I think we're into our 347th year on record, but obviously this ceremony predates Europeans coming to this country. So our green corn Thanksgiving, our cranberry Thanksgiving, when the cranberries come out at the end of summer, beginning of fall. Then our fall harvest. This is when we're gathering everything from our gardens, all that hard work that we put in. It's time to reap all of that and get it processed and stored for the winter. And we would enjoy a feast around that time. Our hunter's moon. I always joke that hunting is the best time in the fall when the deer and animals are looking to find mates. They're off their guard. They're too busy looking for other women to be worried about their own protection. So it's easier. They're moving about. It's easier to hunt at this time. We actually took a group on a walk around the coast, and a buck came right out of the woods and jumped right into our full group of people and just kind of looked at us like we're in his way and where are the women? So great time for hunting in the fall. And then we would have our Nakomo celebration. Now, Nakomos could move throughout the year. Nakomo was a time of giveaway. When you gave thanks for everything that you had by giving away as much as you could and giving till it hurt. That was important. You were known as a good citizen in your community by how much you gave and how generous that you were. That's what made you a great person. So families would gather together all of the things that they had accumulated, all of the art that they had made, all of the furs. They would give as much as they could to everyone in the community. So although this tended to be more at this time of year, it could happen throughout the year at any time. You could have your giveaway celebrations. So when was the first Thanksgiving? So there is no first Thanksgiving. That's a historical myth. There have been many days of Thanksgiving throughout history. When you actually look at historical record, the first proclaimed Thanksgiving Day in the colonies was in 1637. And that's when the Massachusetts Bay Colony Governor, John Winthrop, declared a day of Thanksgiving that was celebrating the Pequot Massacre. During the Pequot Massacre, 700 women and children and elders, they were killed during that green corn Thanksgiving that I was just talking about. There was a huge gathering of our community members. Their village was surrounded. They blocked all entrance and exits. And they tried to completely wipe out these people. And I'm sorry to say that the Narragansett and the Mohegan were allies in that fight. We had allied ourselves with the English. There were many things happening historically that predated English people coming here between tribal communities. I think this was also a turning point for Native communities because that was not our form of warfare, to completely annihilate a people. That kind of genocide was not the way that we fought wars. We didn't fight to completely wipe out a community of people. So for the Native people who had allied themselves with the English, we were actually horrified by what we saw. And I think that was a big eye opener that these are not the same kind of people as us. They don't operate in the same way. And I think there was a leeriness of Europeans after this occurred. But celebrating the genocide of Pequot people is why they celebrated Thanksgiving and actually declared a day of Thanksgiving. And from that time on in early colonial history, the historical records of Thanksgiving proclamations were often in response to these massacres of Indigenous communities. So something worth celebrating. In 1621, This is an event that has kind of been grasped onto by American, what's the word I'm looking for? Community builders? Let me give you some background on what I mean. So the Pilgrims, when they came here to New England area, they were not seeking religious freedom. That's something we often learn in school. They had already found religious freedom in Holland, but what they didn't have in Holland was land and the ability to grow to create economic gains. So they were looking for land, they were looking for opportunities to expand and to grow their own wealth and to expand their community. That is why they came to the Americas. Those who welcomed the Pilgrims off the Mayflower were already well acquainted with Europeans. It was not the first time that we had seen white people. There had been many instances of Europeans and explorers coming here. Verrazano was the first in the 1500s to visit our communities. The Dutch came after, and there were others who came and traded, but also who had kidnapped Native people and sold them into slavery. That is how Tisquantum was taken from the Patuxet village, and he was brought over to Spain and sold as a slave. He was later able to be taken to Europe, and that's to England, and that's where he ended up with the monks and eventually made his way back to the Americas. So we already had an understanding of Europeans. We already had people who could speak their language, who had interacted with them before. But when they arrived on the Mayflower, they were not seen as a threat because they were traveling with women and children. And when people are going into battle, as far as Native Americans understood, you don't bring women and children into battle. So they were not seen as an immediate threat. And the Wampanoag had sought to build an alliance or friendship with the English when they came. So the Narragansett Tribe of Rhode Island was one of the biggest, most powerful nations within the southern New England area. Many Wampanoag tribal communities were paying tribute to the Narragansett. Maybe they were not so happy to have to do that. So they were looking to build other allies that would help to strengthen them against the Narragansett and other larger, more powerful tribal communities. So the Wampanoag offered their assistance in return for building this kind of alliance, this relationship. They gave many gifts to the colonists. They taught them the uses of the land, the natural resources that they could use within this new land. These are people who are coming from a different country. The resources here are different, the food sources, the trees, even how you work the land. So they needed to be taught how to gather, how to hunt, what to gather, what to farm in this new land, what things would grow and how to make them grow, what farming techniques would work in this land, how to harvest and how to store and cook these new foods that they were just being introduced to. They were also taught how to interact with other tribal communities for diplomacy and to create treaties with other tribal groups. How do you speak to people? What is the etiquette when greeting and talking and building treaties between other tribal communities? So they gave these gifts to the colonists through that alliance that was built. How do we know all of this? Well, we have Indigenous oral history. We have our stories that have been passed down for generations, but we also do have some documented primary sources, but they're very small. This paragraph is about all we have to really tell us about what was happening at that time and the whole Thanksgiving story that we've created this whole holiday around. It's just one small passage in a journal. So who was there? This Thanksgiving Day that we celebrated now is built around one event that happened in 1621. Who was there at this event? Well, there was around 50 colonists, 22 men, 4 married women, and more than 25 children and teenagers. On that journey in the Mayflower and on the first winter, 78% of the women had died. Massasoit, who was known as, his traditional name was Usamiquin, he was sachem of the Pokanoket, and he was there with 90 men. Why was he there with 90 men? So we don't know exactly why he was there, but what we do know is that they were not invited. The way that the myth makes us believe is that the native people helped the colonists to survive and work the land, and they had had their first successful harvest. So they invited the native people to celebrate in a feast. They didn't invite anybody. They were having their own gathering, their own feast in celebration for their harvest. They were shooting off guns and cannons, which was common to do during those celebrations. Well, the native people who had just formed an alliance with them heard their weapons going off and thought they were in danger. And that's why they showed up with 90 warriors to come to the aid of their new ally. When they got there, they realized it was just a celebration. They had not been invited, but now we're here. And they were asked to join in, but there was way too many of them. There was 90 of them. So they went out and they hunted, and they brought most of the food to that feast. So they stayed for about 4 days, I think it was. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure, because I'm not good with numbers. But they were there for a number of days. Feasting. We really don't know much more than that. That's pretty much all that was written in this record of what happened. This was an obscure event. And even though they were allies, they weren't necessarily friends, because the Pilgrims still looked at Indigenous people as being uncivilized and satanic heathens, that we worshiped the devil, that we were not of their religion. There's even some writings wondering if we could even find salvation, if that was even possible for us, because we weren't quite human in the way that they were. Indigenous people likewise viewed the Pilgrims as both filthy, because they didn't bathe in the way that we did. They didn't brush their teeth. They didn't have the same hygiene. They wore the same clothes. All of those things were kind of disgusting to us and very different from our culture. And they also looked at them as somewhat incompetent, because they needed to be taught everything in order to survive here. So they weren't necessarily best friends. So then why do we celebrate Thanksgiving the way that we do? How did this event in 1621 become related to the Thanksgiving that we celebrate now? So for more than 2 centuries, that event that happened in 1621 was completely lost to history. Nobody knew about it. Nobody was thinking about it. In 1789, George Washington had declared a Thanksgiving, Thursday, November 26th, a Thanksgiving holiday. It was a time of prayer, but it was not at all linked to those events in 1621. Almost everything that we know that happened in 1621 comes from the documentation that was found by Edward Winslow and William Bradford. And there was a writer, Alexander Young. He was the one who kind of rediscovered Winslow's letters, and he made it famous in a book called The Chronicles of the Pilgrim Fathers in 1841. He printed his letter, and Bradford's manuscript, William Bradford, his manuscript had been stolen by the British during the Revolutionary War, and it wasn't recovered until the 1850s. It was incorporated into a magazine by Sarah Joseph Hale, and she really pushed for a campaign to create an official national Thanksgiving holiday. And she was the one who used this 1621 event of Native people and settlers, colonists joining together and sharing this meal as a unifying event in this country's history. That was something that President Lincoln jumped on, because during the Civil War, he was trying to look for a way to bring this country back together. And so he declared National Thanksgiving Day to be held on that final Thursday in November in 1863. And that's when this, they started to really play on the unification of pilgrims and Native people to say that, isn't this wonderful, people to come together and get along. If they could do it then, we can do it now. And that's when Thanksgiving became linked to that event in 1621. We're talking about the 1860s. So from that period on, we have been really playing into this Thanksgiving story, really building it up. And it has built a lot of myths around the interaction between Native people and colonists. This is pretty much, for most school-age children, your first introduction to Native history at all is that Thanksgiving event of 1621. So we have built stereotypes and generalizations. Many children's books are only written talking about pilgrims and Indians. They don't even say what Native people, they don't even use the tribal communities that were involved. It ignores all of the history surrounding before and after. It plays on the misconceptions of this period of history. It's kind of fantasy of being welcomed into this land. It erases Indigenous voice because it doesn't include our side of the story. It's often told from a Eurocentric viewpoint, and we have cartoons, and it's been portrayed in the media. And all of this is harmful because it builds this stereotype around Native people that we have grown up being taught, and it's almost all that we get taught in the education systems we have now. So do Indigenous people celebrate Thanksgiving? So since 1621, and even prior to that, Native people have suffered from disease that was brought here by Europeans, genocide of Native communities, slavery and indentured servitude, particularly throughout the East Coast, and very definitely here in the state of Rhode Island. Newport was one of the biggest slave ports, and Native people were enslaved. We were sold to the Azores, to the West Indies, Barbados, and Bermuda. After the King Philip's War, many Native people from the New England area were sold from here. Those who stayed, many were taken as indentured servants, even apprenticeships. There's historical records from children as young as 10 months being indentured. At 10 months old, you're taken from your family and put with a white family to be taught to literally be raised to be a maidservant till you were 18 years old. And then you were given to another family. So you were being removed from your tribal community, and through that removal became a displacement of our community. Native people from our areas here in Rhode Island and in southern New England were dispersed throughout the area and even into other countries, and forced into assimilate, forced to accept Christianity, forced to give up our language and our traditional ways. We suffered from poverty and racism and even the erasure of our communities, because very much so here in the state of Rhode Island and other southern New England tribes, we faced a time of detribalization, where they basically wanted to say that we didn't exist as tribal communities anymore. They didn't want to uphold those treaties that were made pre-United States. They didn't respect our government to government relationship. So detribalizing us made a way to make us disappear and be able to take more of our land and more of our community. It was an erasure of our communities here. And we faced generations of historical trauma built on all of these injustices. In the state of Rhode Island, if here is a map of the southern New England area, and you'll see the state of Rhode Island here. And this area here is what was originally Narragansett land, which is most of the state of Rhode Island. This little red dot here is all that we have left. That's our tribal reservation right now. So from our traditional lands to that little red dot, That is what we have left. And if you can see it up close here, this is actually what the reservation looks like. The parts here in purple. And you can see that much of it is swamp. So the great majority of the land that we do now have is not usable because it is mostly swampland.
Silvermoon, may I
Yes.
interject for just a moment on that last slide, just to point out that in Rhode Island here, our most prominent topographical feature is Narragansett Bay. So you can see where the red dot is, where it says Mount Hope. So basically, everything to the west of the bay, you can see that that's Narragansett land or territory, and to the east, you can see the Wampanoag to the east there. So I just wanted to point that out. There are other coastal tribes like the Niantics and so forth. Do you want to talk about them at all, or maybe later?
Eastern Niantic, that would be a very long history if I get
Right.
too entailed. But the reason why the Narragansett and the Eastern Niantic became merged is after the Great Swamp Massacre. Narragansett people who were escaping massacre sought refuge with the Niantic people, and they took them in, and that became a haven for us. So that's why many of us became intermixed with Niantic people. However, after that, after the King Philip's War, because the Narragansett tribe had always been the largest tribal community and the most powerful in the state of Rhode Island, when there were what's the word I'm looking for, like government to tribal relations, they kept just talking to us as Narragansett people. So the Niantic kind of became faded out into to history, but those of us who are survivors of the Narragansett community are also Niantic by blood as well. What's poignant to me here about this map is that the Narragansett people were a coastal tribal community. Our very name, Narragansett, is people of the small point. It's the place where the land meets the waters. That is how we lived. That was what our whole, our spirituality, our sustenance, everything was built off of communion with the waters. And you will see that we do not have ocean access. We have no oceanfront property. We have no water rights to be able to access coastal areas now. So that is one of the biggest things that still affect our tribal community today, being able to carry on those traditions. So in Southern New England, particularly the Wampanoag tribal community, they celebrate a day of mourning, not celebrate, they recognize a day of mourning on Thanksgiving Day. So when others are feasting on this coming Thursday, they do have a march and they do have a gathering for a day of mourning, because they are recognizing all of the history that has happened from the time of this settling of the United States till now. And they're tired of that history being ignored in lieu of this this happy myth that people would prefer to focus on. So that is when in the 1970s this began. I'm sorry that I cannot remember his name, but there was a Wampanoag elder who was asked to make a speech at a Thanksgiving Day event, and his speech was to tell the truth of what happened to Wampanoag people and the things that happened since the Pilgrims came here. And they wouldn't let him give that speech. And that's when they had the march and the protest, and they've been having it annually ever since to make sure that attention is always brought to the truth of what has happened around this time. So when we talk about, do Native people celebrate Thanksgiving? Yes, we do, but not in the way that you think that we do. We are still giving thanks. We still have our tradition of our 13 Thanksgivings. This time of year is our hunter's moon time. So there would be feasting and ceremony and gathering around that. It's part of our traditional ideology to give thanks. It brings balance and harmony with the world around us. We accept nature's gifts, and we remember that we always have to give back, that everything that we do, we're doing for our next 7 generations. So we are still having our own Thanksgivings, but nobody is thinking about the events of 1621 when we're gathered around the table as families, enjoying our meal together. We are there to continue to pass down these traditions, our Thanksgiving celebrations. When we gather as family and hold ceremony, this is when stories get passed on. This is when we're interacting intergenerationally. We're passing on these traditions. We're giving thanks for all of Creator's gifts to us. It's part of our gathering and part of our ceremony to keep passing these ways on to future generations. So that is what we are celebrating when we come together. So can you still celebrate Thanksgiving, and how? This is a time to honor the harvests. Harvests, when I think of food, I very much think of the feminine. In our creation stories, it was the first woman who gave herself to the earth. And when she laid her body into the earth, from her body, all the things that grow on this earth came from that sacrifice. Her hair, the sweetgrass, her rump, the squash, all of those gifts came from the giving of her body. So all of this sustenance on this world, on this earth, came from women, came from a woman's sacrifice. Our gardens were tended by women. Women are nurturers. They bring forth life. And so they do the same in the gardens. They nurture those plants, and they help those plants to give nourishment to our communities and bring forth life. Even our traditional foods, corn, bean, and squash, our most important food sources, we're always called the 3 sisters. They are feminine in their spiritual being to our communities. So we are honoring the harvest. We are honoring the gifts of femininity and of womanhood and of our Mother Earth. So we can still celebrate Thanksgiving time because we are going to honor truth. We are going to educate ourselves on the contributions of Indigenous people. Indigenous people have made contributions to this country. The ecological knowledge that is here, the plants that we have, many of our foodways, the origins of many food sources that now feed the entire world came from the Americas, built on the cultivation of Native people. The American democratic system was inspired by Native people's way of governing. Our values, our culture, our life ways, even a lot of English language now in the Americas is built on Algonquin dialects of the New England area. So we have to remember that there is no United States history without Indigenous history. We have been here from the very beginning. We were here before this country existed, and we are entrenched in every single part of what has happened in the building of this country. So we cannot continue to ignore Native people and our contributions. We should be teaching about it at all times. We can be supportive of Indigenous people today and be truly thankful for these gifts. You can learn more and support Native people by reading books by Indigenous artists, by Indigenous authors. This is a way of actually hearing our stories from our point of view, our history from our perspectives, to be able to see the things that are happening within our communities. And Indigenous authors make up less than 1% of all published authors. So the more we buy books by Indigenous authors, the more we support these stories getting published. We show publishers there's a market for this, and they will actively seek out more Indigenous people to be able to publish and get our voice out there. You can cook Indigenous recipes. Why is that important? And I share this one all the time, especially at this time of year when we're looking for what to cook. We should be including more Indigenous recipes into our diet on the regular. These are built on the foodways that are meant to be Indigenous to these lands. These are the foods meant to grow here. They're the foods that are best for the ecosystem. They are the plants that are best for our native pollinators. if you were to start eating milkweed in the springtime when they're young shoots and they are edible and they're absolutely delicious, if there was a desire for more of these native foods, you'd be planting more of them. And it would be better for our environment, it would be better for our ecosystem. So many things grow out of eating those indigenous foods. When we want Minnesota wild rice, if there was a market for that, we would protect our waterways. And when pipelines are trying to go in on native lands that are a danger to these native grains, we would protect them. So it's important to learn about indigenous foods, build those foods into your diet, and protect those food sources and support indigenous food sovereignty. You can listen to music by indigenous artists, and you can share and purchase and credit art by indigenous artists. This helps to combat cultural appropriation and actually give back to native communities instead of buying appropriated goods. You can listen to and subscribe to indigenous podcasts. There's much to be learned there. Many of the issues that we face as indigenous people does not make it into mainstream news. But when you listen to those podcasts, you get to actually hear what's happening in Indian country, the issues that we are facing, and the supports that we need. So it's a way to kind of educate yourself and support Native people all year round, not just at Thanksgiving. So Wuni Tabutan Tamawak, that means happy Thanksgiving. At Tomaquag Museum, we have some upcoming events where you can join us and learn more. We have a literature and culture author series. Next week, we'll be talking with Dr. Pierre Moranon, and he has done a lot of research around the industrial schools here in Rhode Island. And so he's going to be talking about that, including how it intersected with Native communities. We have an Indigenous Authors Book Club that we hold every Tuesday evening. That is an open event. All of these programs are free to the public. It's a virtual book club that anyone can join in. Right now, we are reading Legacy, Trauma, Story, and Indigenous Healing by a Native author in Canada, Suzanne Method. And we're going to be discussing chapters 1 to 3 tomorrow night, and then moving on from there. So you're welcome to join in at any time, even if you haven't read the books. We have some really great conversations. We have another literature and author conversation coming up in December, where we're talking to West Warwick Public Library, who recently did a summer program with Indigenous youth to teach them about writing. They were mentored by Indigenous writers, and they actually published a work of an anthology called Voices of Warp and Weft. Warp and Weft. It is available from pretty much any local bookseller, definitely on Amazon and all of those places where you can buy books. So by buying this book, you're supporting Indigenous youth. They were actually paid for their writing. So they are all now published, accomplished authors. So that was a really great program. They're going to talk about that program and how it went, and hopefully support more programs like that. And lastly, we have our Away from Home American Indian Boarding School Stories. This is a traveling exhibit from the Heard Museum. And this is the farthest east it's ever come. We don't know if it will be coming this way again. It's not yet on the schedule to, so this is your chance to come and see it in person. It's an amazing exhibit. We are hosting it at the University of Rhode Island. And again, it is free. Tuesdays through Saturdays from 1 to 4. So we welcome you to come. It will be on display until January 7th. And all of this, you can go to our website. I should have waited and made sure you saw. If you didn't notice, at the bottom of every screen was our website, tomaquagmuseum.org, if you want to learn more. And
Great.
that's it.
All right, Silvermoon. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. We've got 75, 80 folks who have tuned in from all over the world, and we've got some questions coming in, so maybe I can share some of these with you. First question has to do with the origins of your name. Can you tell us a little bit about where the Silver Moon comes from?
Sure, that was my mother. My mother's name is Star, A very celestial. My father, so what is it? What's that name you have before you get married?
Your maiden name,
My maiden name.
although some people would say that's not a current phrase to be
Not a
used.
current phrase, but that's all I would know it by. So my family name is Mars. That was my father's last name. So I had a very celestial name, Silvermoon Mars, growing
Mm.
up. I think that just speaks to my mom's creativity, but she came from a mother who was also the same way. She gave her all of her children, she had 12 children, and she gave all of her children very romantic names. She was a big
Nice.
reader, and she just, whatever inspired her became the name. We have Melody Brook, we have Skylark, we have Autumn Leaf. My mother was Star Lee. Lance Preston, Lake Geronimo. She just loved poetic names, and I think my mother just carried in her footsteps.
Right, right. That's great. So maybe you could just say something just to put some in context. How many tribal members are there among the Narragansetts, and
So,
how?
no, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say. I know there's there's a main reservation, if you will, or down in Charlestown, Rhode Island, but there's more than one property. Is there not? In
So
fact,
I'm
there was
sorry.
just there was just a new property.
I see what you're getting at. Yes.
Yeah.
So yes, there's about 3,500 to possibly 4,000 Narragansett tribal members. I'm not sure exactly the number right now. We were moving up closer to 4,000, but I don't know if we're quite there yet. And we are not all within the state of Rhode Island. We are all over the country. So the vast majority does not live within what's considered our service area as a tribal community. Our service area is Washington County in Rhode Island, which is the southern part of Rhode Island. And so because of the rising costs of living in southern Rhode Island, it has pushed many tribal members out of the area. So that is a big concern for our community. We have the reservation, which is about 1,800 acres in Charlestown, but again, much of it is a swamp. We recently were given back the area that is known as the Great Swamp. That is where the massacre of Narragansett women, children, and elders took place during the King Philip's War. That land was just recently transferred back to the tribe. That's about a 10-minute drive from where our reservation is in South Kingston area. So that's what makes up the land that we have left.
And can you say how King Philip's War is viewed by the Narragansett? Would you like to say anything about that conflict?
So that, oh gosh, in
a sense or two,
in a short period of time, that's a huge conversation, because I think it really was the complete change in our history and in our culture as a community. Everything changed after that. The King Philip's War was one of the bloodiest wars on American soil, and it's something that's rarely even talked about in American history, and in schools, nobody hears about it. But it was after that war, that's what decimated so many tribal communities in southern New England. Many of our people were sold away as slaves after that war. Those that remained, many were taken as indentured servants. So I think it was the changing point, because prior to that, we were able to really maintain a lot of our culture and communal ways. We were able to fight for that. Roger Williams, being a state that was free for religious expression, he was able to extend that protection to the Narragansett people so that we weren't forced to be converted. But after King Philip's War, it was his idea to take us as slaves. So it changed everything from then on. And once you become enslaved, once you become indentured or apprenticed, that's when they are able to forcefully assimilate and force you to take on Christianity as your religion. So everything changed after that.
Right.
It just,
Good. I have a couple of interesting questions from some folks in the audience. One is, and I'll read it. I am familiar with numerous college university programs that offer Indigenous ways of knowing and Native study programs. What do you think we can do to promote more education on these issues at the high school and elementary school level?
I think that's a fight that we are doing now as a tribal community in my own school district. We've been coming together as a community to fight for that for our children. We're just asking for more diverse stories. We're asking for more viewpoints. We're asking for more voices to be included. But with that, we need others to step up and ask for that as well. It's a benefit to our children. It's a benefit to our Native children, but also our non-Native children to understand the world around them, the interactions around them, particularly with Native history, because Native people, federally recognized tribes, are sovereign nations. We have government to government relationships with the United States, and that is a part of the political process. So as taxpayers, as citizens, you need to understand your governmental structures, and that includes Native tribal communities and those governments and how that works, because you are going to have to interact with Native people as adults in this country. So being able to learn more about that, be included, why do those relationships exist? What is the history around that? What are the agreements that were made and upheld? I think a lot of the ignorance that leads to issues within our community just comes from not being taught that part of our country's governance.
Right.
So it needs to be included. It's important to have that included here.
Good. Here's a question from Canada. In Canada, horrible things have been done to Indigenous people, and parenthetically, I think this has been in the headlines, as you know, last few months. Our Thanksgiving celebrations, however, are not at all linked with Indigenous peoples. Can you speak to any relationships you have with Indigenous communities in Canada?
So as far as relationships, we have friends and relatives, favorite artists. There's some amazing artists up in Canada that get my money far too often. But I think we do have a shared history. We do have shared traumas. We do have shared experiences and things that we are fighting. There are some tribal communities that cross boundaries of the United States and Canada. So it puts us in community with them. And we have we have community members from Canada who have relocated here, even in Rhode Island, and we acknowledge them as Indigenous people, so they are included in the services that we provide in many of our tribal programming. So they're, kind of included in as relatives and as family because we have this shared history. Native people are all unique tribal communities. We have our own governments, we have our own languages. We are not all one and the same. It would be like saying all of Europe is just one group of people. We are all vastly different, but I think the act of colonization and what we have experienced as a result has brought us into deeper community with one another for that mutual support. And we look at them as our relatives and have built friendships. In my own family, my husband is a traditional drummer, and with his drum group, the Boys, that are based out of Minnesota, they have traveled all over the United States and everywhere in Canada, and they have been welcomed into many communities up in Canada, welcomed into their homes, welcomed into their ceremony. So I think as Native people, we do have a bond with one another that we cherish.
I'm getting a question. Besides your husband, do you have any other favorite Indigenous artists or musicians that you would recommend?
Yeah, I guess I have to say my husband's drum group, the Boys.
Yeah.
But there's a group, if you go on YouTube, it's the Allegheny Singers. I really enjoy listening to them. They sing a lot of social dance songs.
Mhm.
There's a beautiful Indigenous woman named Fawn Woods. She actually sang for one of our events here at Tomaquag Museum, because virtual world lets us bring in people from everywhere. She was able to join us virtually and sing for our honoring ceremony. She has the most beautiful voice. And there's a flutist, Comanche flutist, his name is Dr. Navaquaya, and I love his flute music so much. Gosh, there's so many. It's hard to just choose just a few. I'm also a big fan of Mystic River Singers. They're a powwow group right in Connecticut. They've been a part of our community for such a long time. They're a mix of many tribal nations, including the Mashantucket Pequot, and just a great group of people and beautiful singers, very gifted singers.
Great, great. I did want to share, we have one comment here, which you might like to hear regarding the presentation. Thank you for this great presentation. I give thanks for you, Silvermoon, your ancestors and other Native Americans, for the wealth of knowledge that you have given us, for your respect and deep connection to nature. So
Thank you for that.
getting some very positive feedback from a lot of the audience members. So we appreciate that. We have just a couple more minutes, I think. We're coming up on the hour. Let's see here. Another question. Do you think that we could learn from Native Americans to fix the current dysfunctional, exploitative relationship that we now have with nature? And if so, could you please provide some suggestions?
I do. So I think when we return to our traditional ways, and I don't think this is just a native thing. All people come from the earth. All of us have a relationship with the earth, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. We all live here. We are all dependent upon the health of this earth. I think over time and in different cultures and civilizations, we have been drawn further and further away from our connection to this earth and all of our plant and animal relatives. And as we rebuild those relationships, when you care about plants as more than just these inanimate objects that grow around you, it makes you want to take care of them and respect them and preserve them in a different way when we look at plants as our relatives. So the more we come into communion with them, at the museum, I do a lot of the TEK, traditional ecological knowledge programs. And when I teach little kids, I talk about plants as relatives. And I said, well, who feeds you when you're hungry? Who helps you pray? Who helps you create and do things? And who gives you medicine when you're sick? Our families do that for us, our loved ones. And so do our plant relatives. They feed us, they give us medicine. They help us to pray. Our traditional medicines help us to pray. And they also help us with creating technology, tools that we can use. Games that we can play. These are things, gifts from the earth around us, and they are our relatives. They share these things with us. So when we come into relationship with them and we include them as a part of our family, you wouldn't disregard your family. You wouldn't treat them in a way that's harmful to them. You would preserve and care for their life as much as you would for your grandmother, your aunties, your uncles. So I think it's learning to rebuild that relationship. And there's an author, Robin Wall Kimmerer. She wrote Braiding Sweetgrass. If you have not read it, highly recommend it. I think anyone, even if you're not a big plant person, will absolutely fall in love with that book. It's the most healing and nourishing book I've ever read. And it helps you to see that we do have relationship with plants, even when we don't think we do. And builds an appreciation for building those relationships. So I highly recommend that book.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, ironically, on that note, I'll mention that next week's presentation, it's streaming live at 7 o'clock. And coincidentally, it's called On to Higher Exploration, Personal Recycling. Join our lectures to learn about how green burials are changing the ways we think about life, death, and the importance of sustainability long after we are gone. So keeping with that ecological theme, we'll have that presentation next week. In the meantime, I want to thank Silvermoon LaRose and the Tomaquag Museum for joining us tonight. I encourage all of you who happen to be near us or coming through this area to stop. It's right off of Route 95 on the way to Boston, coming from New York or vice versa. And it's a wonderful place. And we're very thankful that, that the Tomaquag Museum is there, and we're thankful for Silvermoon. So thank you, Silvermoon, for sharing with us.
Tabane, thank you so much for having me. And this was my pleasure. And I do hope you all come and see me. When we say goodbye here at the museum, we teach the kids to say Pishkanash Nitamp, which means see you later, friends. So I hope I'll get to see you guys later. Pishkanash.
Pishkanash, I'll work on that.